Pretty positive message there, huh? Yeah, that was one of those, that was literally come to Jesus meetings for the disciples on that particular day. And I think that when I look at that in the context of when that happened and how it happened, it led me back to the Exodus passage and something that was kind of obscure there, you might say. In that first verse that Marty read from Exodus 19, they had journeyed from Rephidim, entered the wilderness of Sinai, and camped in the wilderness. Israel camped there in front of the mountain. It's an interesting little detail there in that opening verse that's easy to overlook. Israel had finally arrived at Mount Sinai. And this is the moment that all of the entire Exodus story has been building up to. The plagues, the Passover, the parting of the Red Sea, the wilderness, the manna, the thirst, the battles that they endured. And now they stand at this mountain of God, Mount Sinai, ready to receive the covenant. But before Moses tells us, as the story goes on in Exodus, before Moses tells us about the thunder and the lightning and the commandments and the covenant, he quietly tells us, just almost in passing, where they had just come from. They journeyed from Rephidim. Now, at first glance, that seems like just travel information, We lived for many years in early Texas, which is right next to Brownwood, which is 17 miles from the geographic center point of Texas. That's your trivia, if you need it this week. We jokingly always said, well, if you're going to go anywhere, you have to leave early first. Most of you got that. I'm proud of you. And this reference to Rephidim, it kind of seems like just travel information. Yeah, we were over there, and now we're here. But in Scripture, names and places like that matter. There's more to them. And that word Rephidim comes from the Hebrew root that's connected to resting places or places of support, places of refreshment. In essence, Rephidim represents a place of rest. And I think there's something important there, because before Israel could hear God's covenant, before they could receive this instruction, before they could say, which is pretty remarkable what they said, everything the Lord has spoken we will do. Before that, they first had to leave this place of rest, because exhausted people rarely hear God clearly. God didn't bring Israel out of Egypt to exhaust them. I mean, think about what they had endured. For generations, they were in slavery, under slavery in Egypt. They knew bricks, they knew straw, they knew carts, and they knew work, they knew oppression, they knew endless labor. Their worth was measured by their productivity. And Pharaoh never cared about if they were healthy. Pharaoh cared about whether they produced, whether they got the job done. And sad to say, that's oftentimes the way our world works now. The world tells us that our value is our output, what we can produce. And our identity is often tied to accomplishment. And rest sometimes is seen as weakness. And, slow down and you'll fall behind kind of attitude. I was driving this morning earlier before I drove down here, and a song came on the radio, and the title of the song is I'll Rest When I'm Dead. I'll sleep when I'm dead. And sometimes that's, almost our lifestyle. We live in a culture that's kind of addicted to exhaustion, and people wear burnout like a badge of honor. If you ever, I'm not trying to make fun of people who are burned out, because it's a real thing. I've been there. But sometimes people draw that like a sword. Yeah, I had to step back, I'm burned out. Yeah, and it's real. It's real. We ask, how are you doing? And often the response is, busy. Busy. As though busyness itself has some kind of value, as if it's become holiness in our lives. But the God of Exodus is not Pharaoh, and it's not our world. God didn't liberate Israel from slavery only to recreate a culture of slavery in the wilderness. The Lord was teaching them an entirely new way of life. And a part of that covenant living is learning how to rest. Rephidim was more than just geography. It was a turning point. What's fascinating about that is earlier in Exodus, Rephidim was a pretty active place. They had been there before. It's a place where Israel complained about being thirsty. And of course, you know the story of Moses striking the rock and they got water. It's a place where they had doubted God's presence. It's a place where the Amalekites had attacked them and God had defended them. Rephidim was messy to an extent, but it's a reminder that biblical rest is not always the absence of struggle. Rest is not pretending that life is easy and just forgetting and not doing things. Rest is learning that even when we're struggling, God is present. Some people think rest means inactivity. Let me tell you what, I think the opposite of rest is anxiety. You can be physically still and still be spiritually frantic. You can be physically exhausted and still be spiritually anchored and growing. At Rephidim, Israel learned that God would provide water from a rock. They learned that God would fight for them. They learned that they didn't have to carry the entire burden alone. And only after those lessons were they prepared to stand at the foot of Mount Sinai, because covenant requires trust, and rest prepares us to hear God. Notice that the sequence in that chapter. First comes Rephidim, then comes Sinai. First comes rest, then comes revelation. There's wisdom in that order. Have you ever noticed how difficult it is to hear clearly when you're exhausted or when your soul is exhausted? It just seems like that there's too much to do, so little time to do it, and everyone depending on you to get it done. I want to ask you, and you don't have to raise your hand, but have you ever experienced a panic attack? It's a term that got its, it was actually recognized in medical journals in the mid-'70s. And according to, scholars, that's probably been happening since, God created man. It's those times when we're so overwhelmed with things that our body reacts negatively. It shows up in a rapid heartbeat and sweating and trembling and shortness of breath and a sense of choking or closing in, chest pain, numbness or tingling in your fingers. If you've ever experienced it, it's not a pleasant thing at all. And our society seems to thrive on that kind of activity that brings us to that. The psychiatrists call it a panic attack, or the doctors. And you know that when you're emotionally depleted, every problem feels catastrophic. Every decision that you might have to make seems overwhelming. Why another decision? Every criticism that you might receive feels crushing. And every prayer feels like it's just impossible. Exhaustion shrinks our spiritual vision. And sometimes we're asking, well, why can't I hear God? And all the while God may be saying, well, you haven't rested long enough to listen. The prophet Elijah discovered that. You know the story that he had this huge victory on Mount Carmel, and Elijah collapsed under this tree and asked to die. And what did God do first? Did he say, come on, Elijah, get up, rub some dirt on it, big boy, and let's go? That's not what happened. First thing he did was let him sleep. And then he fed him. God fed him. And then God let him sleep again. And after that rest came revelation. Sometimes the holiest thing that we can do is sleep. Just rest. When Israel arrived at Sinai, God offered covenant. You shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples, a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. And remarkably, the people responded together. Everything that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And that response required clarity, attention. It required presence. It required a people who were rested and ready. Because a frantic people could never sustain that covenant faithfulness that was required. Because covenants are relational. Relationships require that we be attentive, that we be awake, that we be present. You all know, you can't nurture a marriage when either of you are ever slowing down. You can't raise children if the parents are emotionally absent or exhausted. And you can never cultivate your faith when your soul is constantly racing to the next thing. Rest creates space for that growth. And that's why the Sabbath became so central to Israel's identity. Sabbath was not just a day off. Sabbath was resistance against Pharaoh's economy, the economy that they had endured for centuries. Every Sabbath day, Israel declared, we are no longer slaves. That's what that's about. Slaves can't stop working. Free people can rest. I'll say that again. Slaves can't stop working. Free people can rest. And then you come to the New Testament, and I think that after all those things, as I read in the gospel account there, all those things that Jesus had done is he passed the mantle on, so to speak, and gave the assignment to the disciples. I think that was because he wanted to rest. I'm going to send those 12 out. I'm going to give them the authority and the power to do what I've called them to do. I'm going to give them instructions on how to handle when the hard times come, when they're out there, and I'm going to rest. Jesus said, come to me, all you are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I'll give you rest. Not merely just relaxation, but rest, soul rest. The kind that Pharaoh or our world can never provide. The kind that achievement doesn't yield, and the kind that money can't buy. Lots of people today are physically alive, but spiritually exhausted. We're overinformed, overstimulated, overcommitted, overconnected. My late and best friend in my life, Don Mapes, used to say, we are the Kodak generation. We are overexposed and underdeveloped. We tend to worship our work at our play, and play at our worship. We carry phones that never stop buzzing, calendars that never stop filling. I'm not a violent person, although, a quick aside, do y'all remember Rodney Dangerfield, comedian guy? He was always, doing this. I'm surprised that I haven't done that this morning because I was weed eating around my shop, I think on Wednesday, and I disturbed a nest of bumblebees. And we had a battle. They reported one casualty, but there was about 10 of them that made it back to the base safe, I think. But in the meantime, they stung me about 5 times, and a couple of times on my neck and on the back of my head, and right here, right there on my chest. So I'm not sure where I was going on that, but no, I do know. I remember now. I'm not a violent person, but I wish that someone had videoed that whole interchange. I had a weed eater in my hand, which I tried to use as a weapon, and that didn't work. Tried to use my cap as a weapon. Nothing really worked. And so I was violent in that situation, but I'm not normally a violent person. But if I could meet the person who created the app that enables other people to put things on your calendar, I might be violent, because that's not a good thing, and I don't like it. But here we are. Our minds never stop racing, and those phones never stop buzzing, and we wonder why we struggle to hear God. Maybe we need our own Rephidim. Maybe before God speaks direction to us, we're invited to rest. And maybe today, you, me, all of us are standing somewhere between Egypt and Sinai. We're free, but tired. We believe, but maybe a little weary. And we want to hear God, but our soul and our mind is loud with anxiety. Well, if that's the case, then hear this good news. God is not waiting for you at the mountain with condemnation. God invites you first to Rephidim, to rest, to breathe, to trust, to remember that you are loved for who you are, not what you can produce. Because once Israel rested, they were finally ready to hear covenant. And perhaps one of the reason why some of us can't hear God clearly is because we've mistaken exhaustion for faithfulness. We think that if I'm tired of working, then surely I must be serving faithfully. We've got to remember that the God who made heaven and earth and all that's within it also created Sabbath. And maybe the most spiritual thing some of us can do this week is to turn off the noise, stop striving, and just sit quietly before God. there's an old joke that, 30 seconds of silence in a Baptist church, people start looking around, what's going on, And that's so very true, I think, in a lot of our lives. That need for silence is something that scares us. But I'll tell you, friends, when you rediscover Rephidim, that just place of rest and silence, there's incredibly rich time there. It's a place of rest. And I hope we all find it and go there more often than we are now. Amen.